Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome to the Guilty as Charged podcast, presented by the Chargers Podcast Network. My name is Steven, and I am your host, as always. And joining me today is my guy, Tyler. Tyler, what's up, man? How you doing today?
I'm excited. We made it to training camp. We survived the summer. We're here, and joining us is a fantastic guest with a fantastic series.
Yes, as you see on your screen here, Mr. Eric Smith for the first time on the Guilty as Charged podcast. So, Eric, thanks for taking the time to join us tonight, man. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Yeah, I appreciate you guys having me on. Big fan of your work. Big fan of the show. And yeah, camp is here, so let's get to it.
Yes. Can't wait to dive into all of that. Super excited to get to Eric's series that he's been writing for the last few months with the conversations with the Chargers assistant coaches. Got some really fun nuggets throughout this whole summer from that series, so we're going to get some of his thoughts there. And then, some thoughts about training camp, which we are 2 days away. The Chargers are going to be reporting tomorrow, the day that you guys will be watching this or listening to this, so could not be more excited for that. As always, Tyler and I are fans of the team just like you guys are. The opinions that we express on the show are not always reflective of the opinions of the organization. This is, an independent content creation project, and so we're happy to be on this channel, very appreciative of the platform that we have been given, and we're going to share some good opinions today with Mr. Eric Smith, so appreciate that. And Eric, let's dive into this series. I think before we get to some of the specifics of each coach or some things that stood out. What kind of went into this series? Because I think this is something that we haven't really seen. Generally speaking, we don't hear a lot from, the quality control coach or the passing game coordinator from each specific team. So walk us through the genesis of this series. What kind of went into the thought process of planning it and your idea for the creation of this series?
Well, it's funny you say your idea. I can't take full credit for it. It was kind of a joint idea between myself and then two of our PR guys, Brock Anderson and Danny Marcano. We were just kind of, I think it was like February or so, we were just kind of kicking around stuff we could do this offseason. And I think we had just hired Kellen, and I was like, obviously we all want to learn more about Kellen, but obviously Doug Nussmeier and a couple other new coaches. And I think it was Brock who said, why don't you just sit down with each of them and do the conversation with series and just kind of get to know them a little bit better. So it was kind of we all just kind of spitballed a little bit, and that's how the idea came about. And for me personally, I feel like I really needed to do this because, one, like you said, those guys, you don't really hear from them, right? So Pat White, who everyone knows from being a college football legend, everyone knows Pat White, but no one's heard from him in years, right? Because he's just been grinding away. So it's how can we get more pub for really all the coaches? And that's whether you're Pat White, a quality control, or you're Chris Beatty, right, who's been around, longtime coach. He's just trying to get all these coaches more pub, and the front office signed off on it. It was great, full support from them. And then for me, it was just good just to sit down with them because I've been here about a little bit over a year now, and just always trying to build those relationships, and try to get to know them better as coaches, as people, And it doesn't really it's a good series, but it was good just to talk to them more than just saying hey in the hallway for 5 seconds. Yeah, it turned out really well. Got a lot of great feedback. Overall, just very happy with it.
Yeah, you did a phenomenal job, and we can just tell how much work went into it and how much prep went into it. How did you go about preparing for these interviews? Because there's so much to have to dive into, and it goes beyond a Wikipedia page. You knew their nicknames, you knew about their families, or you asked about their families, you knew about their playing careers, whether it was in college or the NFL or whatever. How much prep went into all this, and how did you go about preparing for each of these coaches?
Yeah, a good amount for sure. Because for some of these guys, right, it was the first time I'd really sat down and talked to them, more so than even just saying hey, because they're busy and all that. So yeah, I wanted to make sure I didn't come in looking like an idiot, and not having good questions, right? So yeah, like the first thing I did was skim the Wikipedia page just to get like baseline info. But then you just like spend an hour or two just kind of researching each guy, what you can find on them. You write about like the kids and stuff. Like I didn't realize. I think almost every coach on staff has kids. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. And I have like a 14-month-old daughter, and like that's just an easy starting point. To be like, well, let's talk about being a dad. And like the ups and downs with that, and how much we love it, and the tough parts about it, and all that. And from there, yeah, it's like, okay, some guys were more off the field focused. So like with Gift Smith, who was the first one I did, like he coached Roman Reigns in college, right? So it's like, well, that's great. Let's talk about that. For some guys, like Doug for today, like Doug Nussmeier, I really wanted to get into like Herbert, obviously, and like on-field stuff. So it just kind of varied by coach what we spent more time on. And some coaches don't say a lot, even though they're great. Some coaches were 6 minutes, and some coaches were 27 minutes. So like, it's however long they want to talk for. Like I said, a lot of them don't get to talk to the media that much at all. So there was one coach who talked for almost like 35 minutes, and you could tell he was just loving it because he doesn't get that attention, So it was good. Oh yeah, it was just good all the way around.
Yeah, shout out to Sean Surratt for I think the coolest nickname that got revealed in this series. There was a lot of fun stuff in there, like I mentioned, and I think my favorite part of it is like, yes, obviously there's some great stuff on Justin Herbert, and I'm a big offensive line guy, so like the interview with Brendan Nugent was cool, but I think I really enjoyed how much more personal, like you feel like you really got to know these coaches, because like there's just such a robotic nature to coaching in the NFL. But then you read a series like this and you read about, how, Sean Surratt's from West Virginia and how the transition has been for him to California. And you like you mentioned the kids aspect of things, or working with Trevor Lawrence for Chandler Whitmer, for example. So I think there's a lot of great nuggets, and we'll get into them. But I really enjoyed just like how personable, it made it seem all the coaches come off.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that too was kind of the whole idea of getting him during the off season, right? Because like you could tell today, like at Hogue, like there's just a different energy in the building because camp is here, and so they're in meetings, and like I was able to get to Doug with my final one. I got him today for like 15 minutes, and he was great. But even kind of trying to pin him down for that was tough because he's got meetings, and you could tell he like flipped into football mode, like all the coaches did. So getting him like May, June, OTAs are a little bit more laid back. It just worked out, And like I thought, okay, am I going to do it next year? Like I'd like to, but maybe like a different format. I don't know. But for the first year, it was really, really good.
Yeah. So let's get into the answers now that you got from these coaches. Was there an answer from a coach that really stood out to you, one that maybe you were dying to share as soon as you heard it? And then what was it? For me, I loved the answer from Chris Gold about Ryan Ficken, where Ryan Ficken just noticed him during joint practices between the Broncos and the Vikings, and he just kept tabs on him. And as soon as the opening was there, he calls up Chris Gold and says, "Hey, would you like to join my staff?" And lo and behold, the Chargers have one of the most improved special teams units in the league, one of the best in the league, 3 special teams players of the week. Such a great unit. So I love that answer from him.
Yeah, and what's funny is I was actually at those joint practices too, right? Because I used to work for the Vikings. So,
yeah.
When Beep or
Look at
Chris
that.
Gold, when Beep was talking about it, we were laughing because I was like, oh, I'm sure I passed you in the hallway or something. Honestly, for me, I was really excited to talk to Pat White. Just because like I'm sure we're probably all around the same age, like we all grew up playing NCAA football, right? And like Pat White was like the guy to play with.
Yes.
And also, like I said earlier, he got here about a year ago, and like nobody heard from him. Like, and I asked him about like West Virginia and like all that stuff, but like I want to know what like are you like, for lack of a better phrase, like what are you doing here? Tell me what you're working on, and like, are you working with the quarterback? And he's not really. He's working with the wide receivers and Chris Beatty, but he's loving it. He's loving it, and like he said, that he you guys know the story. Drafted second round by Miami, and like his career didn't work out. He's like, I didn't want anything to do with football, but it just kind of pulled me back, and he's loving it now, which is great to see, because he's a good coach, like a good person. He's got a couple kids, and I think he just had his fourth kid like a week or two ago. So yeah, that was good. Let's see, Tom Arth was really good to talk to, because again, been here a year, no one knows what he does like really that much, and he just has like such an interesting backstory, being Peyton Manning's backup. He played in NFL Europe when that was still around.
Right. Yeah.
So he was saying he like was golfing at like St. Andrews and all this like really cool stuff that like none of us have done. And then defensively, I really like talking with Jeff Howard, which is ironic because I actually know Jeff, right, from our time together in Minnesota. But similar to why like the basis of this whole conversation, he never did any media. Right. And like, I never talked to him or interviewed him or anything. And like, we'd say, hey, and like, I knew him. And when he got here, I was excited to see him. But just like learning his story, like he coached at Odessa, which is like the famous high school down in Texas. And just like his thoughts on linebacker and Kendricks and Murray and like all the guys, like it was just really good. So those are a few that stand out, but like really, I'm thankful to all of them because all the coaches I learned like at least one thing from.
Yeah, absolutely, and you can really see that come through. You mentioned Chris Beatty, obviously. Daniel Popper did a great story on him as well. One of the things that really stood out to me with Chris was his answer, particularly about Mr. Joshua Palmer, and there's a lot of buzz about Quentin Johnston. I'm wearing his shirt today inadvertently. I feel like people are kind of forgetting about Mr. Joshua Palmer. So, what kind of stood out to you from talking to Chris, and I guess kind of pivoting a little bit here towards training camp? What are your expectations for Joshua Palmer this year?
Yeah, Chris was great. Just overall, his family lives in Maryland, so he commutes from L.A. to Maryland quite a bit to see his family, which is just nuts. Yeah, he was great on everything. Like I used a good part of what he said about Quentin and like that long form I did a couple months ago. But in terms of Josh, like I really wanted to know what he thought about him because like he's just underrated, right? And like not a lot of people talk about him. And then you draft a first round receiver, and it's like, okay, where does this guy kind of fit in? But the quote he said, he's like, Josh had to be Keenan for us, and he had to be Mike when those guys weren't in the lineup. And he didn't mean it like Josh Palmer trying to be Keenan Allen, like the player. He's playing the position that Keenan would play on that particular play, or same goes for Mike. And he caught like 70 passes. Like I think back to that Atlanta game, he was really clutch in that Atlanta game and getting that last second win. Where does he play out? It's going to be a battle, right? Like you can't sit here and say there's not a battle for wide receiver 3. But I think if we've learned anything from the team or just like around the NFL, you're going to need more than 3 receivers all year long, right? To like have a successful offense.
Right.
So for everyone who wants to like anoint Quentin as the number 3 receiver right now, that's fine. He's a first round pick and all that, but you're going to need a lot of receivers at some point. It's just like, corners. You're going to need cornerback depth. And if guys get nicked up at some point, then you're going to need Josh Palmer to play 80, 85 snaps a game at some point. So, like, it's just a good, like, healthy competition. And that's the way I look at it more than, like, who's going to win, like, a starting spot. I look at it like, how good is, like, the group going to be? And, like, it has high potential for sure. Like, they can be one of the best rooms in the league, but they all have to contribute to that. If we focus on like, oh, well, Quentin Johnston is getting more playing time than this, well, that may be good for Quentin in his long-term development, but is it like, to me, like, let's have all 4 guys shine this year and help Justin Herbert as much as we can.
Yeah, I'm really curious what they do with the room overall because they've been carrying 5 wide receivers. Last year, they switched from 5 D tackles to carrying 6. And it seems like this year they're going to carry 6 wide receivers. And really, Chris Beatty, like the answers he gave about Jalen Guyton when he got to him, it wasn't just like, well, he's just kind of fast and, we missed him. But it was like, no, he's an integral part of this, and we really needed him out there. And if he's healthy, we're going to need him out there this year. So I'm really curious what they do with the room overall. Another quote I'd like to ask about is from Jeff Howard, who said, he's talking about Eric Kendricks. Eric Kendricks, to me, really embodies the energy and focus. What strikes me about Eric is he is a football player. He's not a celebrity first. He's a football player. What did you make of that quote and what that means?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with it like wholeheartedly, and that's because I also like Jeff have a previous relationship with Kendricks and like know him probably better than most people who follow the Chargers do or cover the Chargers. I was fired up when I saw that we were going to sign him. Like, you can ask my wife. I was like fired up in our like living room. What that quote means, I think, is like he just makes plays. Like, he's always kind of been an underrated guy, even though he was a second round pick from a notable school at UCLA and like won the Butkus Award. Like, people knew who he was, and it wasn't like he was like an undrafted guy. But he's always felt like he was underrated, mostly because of like his upbringing. I think like he grew up in Fresno. He's from like a single parent household. Like, he really had to like grind to get to UCLA, and once he got to UCLA, he worked hard and like became the player he was, and then like thrived in Minnesota. But he still talked to him. He still has that chip on his shoulder, and probably now because he comes to the Chargers. And what's the question everyone's asking now? Oh, is he still a good player? Like, how much does he have left in the tank? Mm-hmm. And like, I get where that's coming from. And my view of him is probably like skewed a little bit, right? Because like, he's just such a good player, and like I know him like personally. I think he has plenty left in the tank, and like, even if he's not where he was back in like 2017 to 2019 when he was like an all-pro and the Vikings had like the number one defense in the league, even if he's not like 10 out of 10, if he's just like 8 or 9 out of 10, he's still a damn good player, and he's gonna help the defense. I'm like fired up that he's here. I know Jeff is fired up that he's here. When we hired Jeff, we talked about it a little bit. I mean, just definitely like good vibes all around with EK.
Love it.
Yeah, and EK just recently voted into the top 100 again tonight as well. So congratulations there. Yeah, 93. So one of the other things you mentioned, Gift Smith and his background with Roman Reigns. We talked about this when the story came out on our show about his quotes about Tuli Tuipulotu, and that was kind of a pick that really went under the radar on draft weekend. And I really liked the follow-up question about him being a project player, and he said no. But then you jump into the quote before, and you talk about kind of like the character, or Gift talks about the character of Tuli, and he says, I just think to be able to go into this room, be a sponge, absorb Joey and Khalil and all the guys' knowledge. I think he can do a lot of things that we want to do at the position, especially on third down like we did last year. Great family, great kid, and really, really good football player. So what did you make of the way Gift spoke about Tuli and the potential that he has to make an impact as a rookie?
Yeah, you could tell, like, so Gift, like I said, was the first coach that I talked to, and this was, I think, like the first week of May. It feels like forever ago. He was very, very high on him, and like maybe it was like the post-draft glow, right? Because like he had just got drafted like a week or so before. Like OTAs hadn't even started yet, but he was just so high on him, and I think it's because like he just has a lot of potential, and he's coming into a good spot. I think that's what. It's kind of similar to Quentin a little bit. Like, he's not going to be coming in here and asked to play, 90% of the snaps at edge and be, called upon to try to be like a Pro Bowl player. That's not what the Chargers are going to ask of him, which is fine. Sometimes I think people look at like players drafted in the first and second round and just assume they need to make like an immediate impact, like Rashawn Slater. And, like, not every player is going to do that. Everyone kind of goes at their own pace and has their own story. So, with Tui, like, just come, like, literally what Gift said. Come in on third down, help rush the passer. If it's a rundown and like you need him to move inside because he has that flexibility. Maybe he kind of shows something there in camp. All this kind of has to play out. We didn't see any run. It's so tough to evaluate the run in OTA because they're not even doing anything. But yeah, I think he can be like a good role. Like he can have like that third like edge rusher role, and just learn from Khalil and Joey, and just kind of just go at your own pace as a rookie. You know, that doesn't mean like sit on the sideline and do nothing. Like you still need to contribute, but again, you're not asked to be like the guy, and I think that's a good spot for him to be in.
Yeah, it's a great spot. Learning from two greats, and then Chris Rumph will obviously work in as well. He's improved. He's going to improve, have a role. I do want to ask about Brandon Staley next and this coaching network that he's built. Because from the beginning, it seems like Brandon Staley has really added coaches from different backgrounds, different levels, years of experience, etc. But it really feels like this year he's focused on maybe like checks and balances and really vertical alignment. So they add Phil Serchia to help the offensive line, which already has Sean Serrett, Brandon Nugent, John Timu, who they promoted. He says, he told you he offers, and no offense to Jay Rogers, right, a younger and former player perspective that Jay Rogers doesn't really have. Kellen Moore has Doug Nussmeier, who you just interviewed. They add Robert Muschamp, etc. So Serrett talked about how Staley references lesson planning, which is, with his teaching background, of course. Serrett has a background, obviously, and then Staley with his background and his family's background. So how do you think having this network of educators helps the Chargers improve this year?
Yeah, that's a good point, and that I should have mentioned that off the top of what like kind of stood out overall. Teaching is feels like it's almost like the backbone of this coaching staff. Almost all of the guys I talked to said like even if they weren't a teacher, they feel like they're teachers now in a way, and like Derek Foster was like, I'm like the teacher in the classroom, and like it starts with me. He has to set that example, right, of like what the vibe of the room is and all that. And nearly every coach I talked to kind of had that same mentality. Like before we even like get on the field, I need to teach them like what we're doing in the classroom, and that's especially prevalent right now, like on offense because it's a new offense. But then you look at it and like Jeff Howard was a chemistry teacher at Odessa. Like I didn't know that, and that's just like really like fascinating stuff. And I think one thing that stood out from my talk with Doug today is like he said that the coaching staff to him feels young because he's one of the older coaches now, and not only are they like focused on teaching, but like just bringing new ideas and having a bunch of like youth and energy. And Doug said it really well. He's like, I've been around the game a long time. I'm like paraphrasing. He's like, I've been around the game a long time. There are different ways to win, like different ways to be successful. You don't need to do the same way every time. So if there's a bunch of young guys on our staff and they see the game from a different perspective because they grew up maybe like in a different area or like they just played a different position, that's good. Like we welcome all that. And I think all that is just kind of gonna like blend together to try to make the coaching staff as good and like as sharp as possible, and then hopefully that bleeds out onto the field with the players in the locker room, and it just creates a bunch of team success.
Yeah, I think to that point too, there's one thing that I've always kind of noticed with this staff is a lot of these guys have played different positions than they coach or coached different positions previously. Brendan Nugent played linebacker. Jay Rogers was a quarterback like Brandon Staley was. All these different kind of things. You mentioned Pat White coaching the receivers. How do you think that really kind of helps these coaches hone their craft and grow as the teachers that you're just mentioning here?
Yeah, so that's, I don't want to like give anything away. I have I'm trying to work on a story about that during camp about how like different like perspectives and viewpoints change like how people see the game, and like being a former quarterback is big in that, and like Brandon Staley is the best example, right? A former quarterback who's now a defensive minded per se head coach. I think it just kind of goes back to like the different views of the game, right? Like there's so many ways and so many lenses to view the game through that different perspectives are good. And if you two see it differently than I do, well, let's sit down and talk about it. And maybe we kind of, if you guys have an idea and I have an idea, maybe what ends up showing up on the field is like this third idea that we kind of come up with together that kind of blends both of our game plans or whatever it is. And that's good. I'm a big fan of like creativity and culture and all that. And like you gotta, and almost like competition a little bit too. Like one person shouldn't be dominating, these conversations. Let's have everyone involved and let's figure it out together.
Yeah, I love hearing that. That is such a teaching environment sort of thing. I just got my degree in education. Steven works in education. So this all kind of like floats around the same spheres that we operate in. Is there a coach, I'm sure all of them to be completely honest, but was there one coach in particular, especially one that maybe you'd want to highlight that doesn't get a whole lot of shine, that people should be talking about more? Going through it for me, like Pat White was one of them, especially because, yes, he works with receivers now, but he said he wanted to become a head coach someday and he wanted to jump into that quarterback room. So I could see him doing that maybe as early as next season. I think we've talked about like Tom Arth being that next guy, but I feel like Pat White could be that, working with the quarterbacks if, say, Kellen Moore gets hired, Nussmeier leaves or becomes offensive coordinator. So is there a coach on the rise that people should be talking about more?
Yeah, I liked your two. I thought, and I talked about Pat and Tom already. I was really interested to talk to Tom Donatel, mostly because, I overlapped with his dad in Minnesota for I think it's 3 months. So I didn't get to know his dad that well. But when Derek Ainsley was promoted to DC and then Donatel was bumped up to secondary coach, everyone's raving about Tom Donatel, and it's like, well, who is this guy? I really wanted to find out. And you talk about the teaching aspect we just mentioned. He was really good on that. How he kind of comes up with different techniques and tricks and stuff to teach players, because similar to being in a classroom, not all 10 DBs or 15 DBs he has are going to learn the same way. So, okay, maybe this method works for 5 guys, but then there's 3 guys who need a second method, so it's how can we kind of do that? But overall, he was just really smart. And I just, he's got kids, so we talked about that. So just I really enjoyed, I feel like I learned something from him, which is what he talked about, what he tried to do with his players. So he was really good. And then I love special teams, Ryan Ficken is my guy, but I like talking to Chris Gold too. He's just a good, funny guy. So he added a sense of humor to it, which was good, because some of the coaches at first were I don't do much media stuff, and but Chris Gold was just, him and I are cool. He's funny, and it was good.
Love to hear that. Yeah, Ryan Ficken is, we're big fans of his on this podcast. He can do no wrong in our eyes. So we'll get to some training camp questions here before we wrap up. Tyler and I have talked a lot, basically the entire summer, about this impending slot corner battle, and then Daniel Popper today goes out and says that he thinks this is Jasir Taylor's job to lose. We've been kind of talking about Ja, like I said, all summer, and people are kind of always hesitant to buy in. You've interviewed his coaches, you see him practice. What do you make of Jasir Taylor's potential role for this defense in 2023?
Yeah, I'm high on Ja. I thought he played really well last year, and most of that came on special teams. But when he did get in defense, about at the second half of the year or so, he really flashed. I thought he did well. And he's kind of a bigger guy, so he can maybe offer something different than Zant does. If we're talking about different slot options, all this obviously is assuming that JC is healthy, and the 2 outside corners are JC and Micah Davis. But I don't know. I think you can just be flexible with it, and maybe there isn't a starting corner or a starting slot corner on the team, like a guy who owns the position, like you see on most teams. Maybe they can just be multiple on defense, and they have different packages where one package is Zant, one package is Ja, one package is Derwin. I don't know. They have all this talent. Why not just kind of utilize it differently as best you can? And and that's not to like take anything away from Pop, who thinks Ja's going to be the starter. Like, he was in there with the first team defense this offseason, but that's because JC wasn't out there. So, I'm not going to make any, Pop and I have different roles, right? Like, I work for the team and he doesn't, but like, that's just a good battle to follow in camp, and maybe he ends up being right, maybe Zont wins the job. I don't know. But it's a good problem to have. The more talent you can have at corner, definitely the better.
Yeah, it's something that we have to discuss. We have to declare a winner, but it doesn't really matter in the end, to be completely honest. At least not with this particular spot, not in the defensive backfield at all. But again, we have to declare somebody a winner. And even who ends up winning it, maybe they don't keep it for the entire year. I mean, so much changes. This guy makes the 53. And he's not on the roster 2 weeks later. He's a starter. He's not a starter. I mean, Michael Davis was a gunner last year. Now I can't imagine a better corner for them last season. So, Eric Smith, what are you looking forward to in camp this year?
You know what I'm like is really so obviously J.C. Jackson's health is obviously probably the top storyline, right? Because like everyone wants to know that. But like I said, I love Ryan Ficken. I'm like fascinated by this kicker battle. And maybe that's because
Nice.
a lot of other spots. There's not a ton of there's maybe like battles going on, but there's no spots on the offensive line, right? Like we talked about receiver, the playing time going for there is like the third guy per se. Like Alohi Gilman is probably gonna be the starter next to Derwin at this point. Like something drastic has to happen. So, like, if you look around the starting 22, it's pretty set, right? There's not, like, anything crazy that we're going to be watching. It's more like slot or, like, depth positions. But there's only going to be one kicker, right? And, like, I love to track that during camp. It's, like, one of my favorite things to do is track kicker stuff and all that. And it's just, like, really fascinating because you either go with, like, a veteran who has had a nice like bounce back to his career in the last year and a half per se, and unfortunately he got hurt with Hopkins. People don't like remember like that Denver game at home. He could barely walk, right? And he's out there kicking field goals and like literally had to be carried off the field because he couldn't get off the field on his own. Or on the flip side, you have a young, I think. Dicker's like 24. You have a young guy who like if he shows the consistency he did last year, maybe that's your franchise kicker for the next like 10 to 15 years. Like that's where what he could potentially be. Like not saying he will, but he has that potential just because he's so young and did so well as a rookie. So either way, like they're in a good spot. And both guys are good guys. Like I'm not rooting for any one guy to win the job. And I'm glad I'm not making that call because it's going to be a tough race, I think, and it'll go well late into camp preseason. It'll be a tough one down the stretch. But like I've written and I thought Pop wrote it today. Like whoever that doesn't win the job is surely like a potential trade chip. And that just like it's just like a win-win for the Chargers.
Just following up on that kicker battle real quick, do you ever find yourself overanalyzing the quotes you get? Because I was reading the interview, answers you got from Chris Gold, and he talked about that kicking room and this battle that's going on. And he said he wanted to really develop a kicker and make them elite and create longevity for the kicker. And my first thought was like, well, that sounds a lot more like a second-year kicker than it does a veteran. When you're talking about developing them, making them elite, finding that longevity. Granted, kickers can play a lot longer than everybody else. But I kind of overanalyzed that one for sure.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. I mean, I definitely see what you're saying, but it's not like Hopkins is 40 years old, right? Like I think he's like 30, so he can still play another 10 years. Like you said, kickers play a long time. I thought the like longevity part of that was related to both guys, where it's like whoever doesn't win the job, they want the other person to go to another team and then kick for 10, 15 years, on their own. So that's how I sort of like interpreted that.
Gotcha.
For what it's worth, Cameron Dicker is only 23, and
23.
Dustin Hopkins will turn 33 during the season.
Okay, a little bit off there. I gotta
So-
study up on that
That's
90-man
okay.
roster. You know?
You're forgiven.
I didn't know either. I had to Google it. I was like, oh man, if he's 24, that means whatever. I don't want to get into age right now. I'm too young to complain about age. It is what it is. But Eric, we'll get you out of here on this. We kept you for a little bit longer than we said we would, unless Tyler has any other questions. But who's a player that you think will surprise fans during training camp? There's always one. In 2019, it was Tyron Johnston. Everybody ended up loving him. 2020, maybe Braden Fajoko was kind of that guy. Is there somebody this year that you think will surprise some folks and maybe end up training camp being a fan favorite?
That's a good question. I'll give you two names, one on each side of the ball.
There we go.
I'm excited to see what Daiyan Henley can do. And I wrote this, so I have a mailbag coming out tomorrow, and I got to ask about him, but I'll just spoil the answer here. I know a lot of people have talked oh, well, maybe he can replace Kenneth Murray, and I understand that line of thinking, but I just don't see it immediately because it's such a big jump from college to the NFL. So why not just have him go be an absolute monster on special teams and make that unit even better than it has been, and then he can sort of work his way into the defense, and maybe with Tui, maybe there's packages where he comes on the field. I don't know. I'm just spitballing, but he has potential, sure. But I think just to say, oh, you're gonna just replace Kenneth Murray, who maybe needs to be more consistent, but he's still a solid player. So I don't think asking a third round rookie to come in and just play in Brandon Staley's complex defense is a sure thing. Let's let him develop on special teams and take a more traditional route to get on defense maybe down the road. Offensively, I'm going to go with Isaiah Spiller just because we don't really know much about him. He barely played last year. It was sort of a de facto or redshirt year for him. And so I want to see what he has, and I think he has potential. I know the coaches are high on him. Derek Foster would praise him a lot and said he has the right attitude and he works hard. It's kind of maybe his time to take that next step forward. And if he can, that's just a really good boost to the running game that we all need to be better than it was last year. So yeah, this is probably my two guys, younger guys, kind of see what they got.
Would love to see it. I know there's a lot of Isaiah Spiller fans out there on social media, and same with Mr. Daiyan Henley. Real quick about Daiyan. In 2020, Mr. Kenny Young, a former linebacker of the Rams, had 100 snaps on the regular season from the slot. Maybe a potential role for Mr. Daiyan Henley out there for some good snaps out there as well.
You never know, right?
So you're saying that Daiyan Henley's going to win slot?
Yeah.
Let's give Daiyan Henley 900 snaps from the slot.
No. Good thought, though.
All right, Tyler. Any other? Sorry about that, Tyler. Any other thoughts here for Eric before we head out for today?
No final questions. I just want to say thank you for doing this series. Obviously, for joining us today, I appreciate that. But for doing this series, we are fans. We're starving for content. There's nothing really to talk about. So for you to publish 21 of these over the course of the offseason, we really appreciate that as fans. So thank you very much.
No problem. I enjoyed it too. Like I said, I got some good feedback, so I appreciate you guys' support.
Yes, and honestly, we dedicated a few shows to your articles about that. So that's a sincere compliment for sure. We hope that this is a recurring thing. We would love to hear about these coaches again next year if there's any new hires or whatever the case may be. Looking forward to that, and looking forward to meeting you in person, Eric, this weekend. Looking forward to your coverage at training camp. Chargers fans, make sure to give Eric a follow. Make sure to check out all his articles on Chargers.com. And as always, we will talk to you soon. Bolt up.